In the summer of 2020, residents of Sitka, a small Alaskan town between Anchorage and Vancouver, held a vote. By a 6-1 margin, the town council decided to remove a statue of Alexander Baranov, a Russian colonial governor notorious for enslaving indigenous peoples of Alaska, Tlingit and Aleuts people. Baranov's actions were so brutal that the Tlingit called him No Heart. So while the statue's removal was part of America's racial reckoning, Sitka's focus wasn't on Confederate symbols. It was on Russia's colonial legacy in Alaska. Yet Baranov's removal only scratched the surface of a long and bloody history. So picture this. The icy waters of 18th century Alaska, a land brimming with life and culture, but now faced with the arrival of fur hunters, the pромышленники. They promised local wealth and spoils of so-called great civilization, but that was false advertisement. These traders weren't just after sea otters and intercultural exchange. They waged a cruel campaign of murder and enslavement. In Alaska, Russians followed the same colonialism playbook they've tested on dozens of indigenous nations of Northern Asia in the previous 200 years. First, you slapped the locals with a tribute tax, paid on local riches. It was fur for Alaskan. If they refuse, you kidnap their family members, including kids, and hold them hostage until the tax is paid. Sexual violence was the norm. Some communities would regularly lose up to half of their children in those raids. Not all came back alive, and those who did would often be already Russified and re-educated to forget their roots. A fierce resistance grew. One day, the Aleut warriors successfully decimated the Russian colonial outpost, but the empire returned with more men and guns. According to historian of Native America Claudio Sant, the Russian captain Ivan Solovyov arranged the captured Aleuts in a line. Then he fired at the first to discover how many people the bullet would pass through. The slaughter was so atrocious that the sea around became bloody with those who threw themselves or were thrown into it.
What the Russians were doing to the Aleuts, what the Russians were doing to the Aleutic, what the Russians were doing in terms of massacres, in terms of hostage-taking, in terms of enslavement, and in terms of, again, at the end of the day, the kind of resource extraction that they were engaged in Alaska was in so many ways identical with a story of European colonialism that many of us in the United States or in North America are already familiar with.
This is Casey Michel, a fellow journalist from the United States. Thanks to his reporting, I learned about the story we opened this episode with. I asked him if he himself was shocked to discover these little-known facts.
You know, these crimes are still so underappreciated, they're so unknown. You know, kind of the story of European colonization in North America is limited to what the British were doing, what the French were doing, and what the Spanish were doing. And the story of Russian colonization, Russian colonial crimes in Alaska is almost never included in that. It is almost never shared, it's never examined, it's never investigated. If we had a better understanding of what Russia had been doing in Alaska to Alaska's indigenous populations, taking place in the exact same ways at the exact same time as what the British and the French and the Spanish were doing in North America, then we would see Russia as the European colonial power it has always been. And we would have been a lot less shocked and a lot less surprised to see those colonial legacies playing out in Putin's Russia, in modern Russia, most recently and most spectacularly and most tragically in Ukraine.
Hey there, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a journalist and author of the Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. Despite researching and learning about Russian imperial conquest for over a decade, I kid you not, but there is not a single day coming by that I don't discover another colonial atrocity committed by Russia throughout history. There have been that many of them. Through this season of Matryoshka of Lies, our goal was to introduce you to the phenomena of Russian colonialism and explain you why it stayed hidden in plain sight for this long. For many years, I believed that just presenting you with the facts, which the Russian Empire worked hard to erase or cover up, is good enough. However, more and more of you come to my book shows and say that learning this dark history is just a first step, and then you also want to figure out how to end this. One podcast episode, of course, won't do the job, but let me introduce you to my favorite voices who can imagine the world without Russian colonialism. This is Matryoshka of Lies, Ending the Empire episode.
I think the case of Ukraine and our situation as anti-colonial subjects in the anti-colonial struggle is really, really different and maybe in some ways much more complex than some other anti-colonial contexts.
Oleksiy Radynski is a Ukrainian filmmaker and my favorite Ukrainian anti-colonial voice. He has just released an excellent short film called Where Russia Ends that, among other things, highlights the role of Ukrainians in helping the empire to expand. After all, Russian colonialism started with a Kievan colonial outpost in the northern borderland woods called Moscow.
Ukraine has not just been a colony of Russia, it has been a colony of Russia, but it has also been a core of the empire in many ways, mostly in imaginary ways. So this kind of myth of the Kievan Rus that was basically made up by the imperialist historians in Russia. So in imaginary ways, Ukraine has been a core of Russian imperialist imagination. But also in practical ways, in material ways. So when Ukraine historically has been subjugated to Muscovy in the 17th century, which was actually before the Russian Empire came to be a bit later, quite immediately Ukrainians, and more specifically Ukrainian Cossacks, became the tools of imperial expansion in other places of what came later to become occupied by Russia, like Siberia, for example. We have to really come to terms with the fact that we are not simply the victims of Russian colonialisms and Russian imperialism. We are, our distant ancestors, but also not so distant ancestors, and some of our contemporaries are also the perpetrators of colonial crimes, or at least are complicit in many different ways.
The first significant blow to Russian colonialism will come with the victory of Ukraine. That's why through all episodes of this show, I emphasize over and over again how supporting Ukrainians in their resistance seems like the best act of anti-colonial solidarity so far. But unfortunately, it might not deliver the final blow to the empire. Decolonization of the Russian Federation is what will finish the job, Radynski says. This decolonization starts with the currently or previously colonized people too.
I think Ukraine could have issued an official apology, basically admitting its part in this kind of guilt and its complicity with the colonial crimes of white Slavic settlers who expanded towards the eastern territories from Moscow and basically genocided quite a few communities and nations all over Northeast Eurasia. I know it's not going to happen probably anytime soon, because in this current situation of this non-stop atrocity, I know it's hard. I think sooner or later this should happen, and this will have not only a symbolic meaning but also quite a practical meaning, because we have to get serious about decolonization of Russia, which is not a metaphor.
Then there is another elephant in the room that we usually don't like to address, but it has accompanied colonialism since the dawn of time.
It's based on basically extraction of so-called natural resources, mostly fossil fuels, mostly oil and natural gas, that are extracted from the basically unceded indigenous lands in the Russian-occupied Arctic and Siberia, and then transported over thousands of kilometers and burnt into the atmosphere somewhere in the First World, mostly in Germany. which is basically actively contributing to demise of humanity as a result of global climate disasters.
The global fossil fuel economy.
The Russian regime is not just another settler, like white settler empire. It is a white settler empire, but it's an empire that's specifically built and is still able to function, mostly because it's able to extract fossil fuels from below the ground and make others burn them into atmosphere, which is something we really should have stopped doing for a very long time. I think that fossil fascism is actually a very succinct description of the Russian regime right now. And without the demise of the Russian Federation as this colonial extractivist project, I think there's really not a very big chance for humanity as a whole to get off this fossil fuel needle, to get away from this suicidal dependence on fossil fuels, of which Russia is one of the biggest actors.
So we cannot be against colonialism, but then still heating our homes and driving our cars with fuel that colonizers stole from indigenous lands. The fuel we buy with our money, which then the colonizer regimes like Moscow used to steal more indigenous lands. This is crazy, right? And then there is a question of what role the Russian passport holders have in ending their colonial empire.
Idea that there are experiences that change people, that shape people. If we didn't believe that people could change, then we would all just jump off a bridge now. Because look at the condition of the world. I mean, look at the condition of how the world has been. I come from a country that was built on slavery. If we didn't believe there was a potential for us to be better, then why don't we all just give up? And for me, the Maidan was such an extraordinary symbol and moment of illumination of that potential, that we human beings have the capability of something more, of something better, even if that's realized very rarely, even if just for a flicker of the second.
This is Dr. Marci Shore, a Yale historian of modern European intellectual history.
When is there going to be a revolution in Russia? Why isn't there a revolution in Russia? How do you get a revolution?
We met with Professor Shore when she was documenting the Ukrainian pro-democracy Maidan revolution for her brilliant book, The Ukrainian Night. Years before Ukraine became everyone's hottest topic, Dr. Shore was convinced that the Ukrainian anti-tyranny resistance could inspire progressive change worldwide, even among Russians.
And I also saw, among my Russian friends and the oppositionists who I talked to after 2014, there was admiration and awe and also jealousy. I mean, the sense that this is what we so wanted to do and we were unable to do. I mean, Russia has this problem, this kind of classic problem that you have this intelligentsia, but they're cut off from the people, and how did they ever reach the people?
In the last century, many Western empires violently fought and lost their colonies, while others gave them up. Western imperialism became universally shamed, including by many of the citizens of these former empires. Yet the same has never happened through various iterations of regimes in colonial Russia. Dr. Shore spent decades of her career investigating what launches a domino effect for radical positive change within our societies. Unfortunately, she doesn't see anything close to that happening within Russian society yet. Maybe that's why she's passionately advocating for army in Ukraine, the most unlikely advocate for armed resistance I have ever met, to be honest.
I grew up in this American Jewish community. My great-grandparents were pogrom victims of Ukrainians in a place between Dnipro and Kiev. My great-grandmother, who I knew growing up because she died when I was 7, so I saw her once a week or so for the first few years of my life. Her fiance was murdered by Ukrainians in front of her. But I did not grow up in a community that had any warm, fuzzy feelings about Eastern Europe, although my grandparents never spoke about it. I grew up in a Jewish community with Holocaust survivors. Anything connected to Germany was anathema. People who bought a German car in that community were ostracized. I became a teenage peace activist. I wore peace sign earrings and a tie-dye t-shirt to Abbie Hoffman's memorial service when he committed suicide in April 1989. I was committed to pacifism. And now here I am, this middle-aged Jewish mother going to Germans and pleading with them to immediately send all possible lethal weapons to Ukrainians, which is layer upon layer of irony that, I never possibly could have imagined. And yet I'm doing this, I should say, with no ambivalence. I'm with a sense of despair, but not with ambivalence, because I don't actually see any other way. I understood from the beginning that Ukraine had to absolutely win. Putin's regime has to be completely brought down. There needs to be a total crash, total reset, in what is now the Russian Federation.
Lastly, there is still unfinished homework for anyone around the world who's serious about ending colonialism for good. I love how my colleague Casey Michel is always laser-focused on solutions in his reporting. He warns me that we cannot treat something that we, thanks to Russian imperial propaganda, keep misdiagnosing.
Those of us in the West still have this understanding of colonialism, most especially European colonialism, as something that took place overseas, that took place across oceans. There's this term in political science called the quote-unquote saltwater fallacy, which says that colonialism and of course the crimes associated with colonialism can only take place, again, across water, overseas, in places that are not territorially adjacent to the colonial powers themselves. Including Russia accurately in the story of European colonialism would have allowed us to be significantly less surprised by what we have seen take place in Russia in recent years, and making sure that we understand Russia as part of that European colonial story in North America and elsewhere is, frankly, at the end of the day, one of the keys to finally beating back, finally defeating, finally ending once and for all Russian colonialism writ large.
So I want to end this episode and this season with something I heard from Dr. Marci Shore. I always reach out to her when I hit an intellectual hopeless dead ends. And you hit, unfortunately, many of them when you research Russian colonialism. Its lifespan has been so long and the evil deeds so numerous that often you feel ending it is just beyond possible. So we catch up with Dr. Shore after her another trip to wartime Ukraine. There she keeps supporting Ukrainian students in any way possible. And she beams with hope, and her resistance spirit is 10 out of 10.
My fantasy was that this generation of students will be the ones who are unafraid to look at the past with all its hell and nightmare and bloodiness and guilt and ambivalence with eyes wide open and confront the truth and look at the ways in which society has broken down in the past and think, we're going to take stock of all of that and we're going to find a way to do it better. I feel like when I'm with the students, when I'm with these young people, I think like that is the hope, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us. I feel privileged that I'm even able to give them support. I feel like they need all support possible, and that my cosmopolitan fantasy is that, Ukraine is also going to be the cosmopolitan avant-garde, leading the way for let's think about what human dignity means. Let's think about how we treat people as subjects and not objects. Let's think about how we treat people with a sense of equality and respect. We all need that. We need that in my country. We need that in the Middle East. We need that everywhere. And so I'm clinging to the hopes that I'm getting from Ukrainians.
The show is written by Yev Kopyka and Vlada Toporkova, produced by Elena Polyakova, mixed and sound directed by Anastasia Fedoskina, co-produced and narrated by me, Maksym Eristavi. Thanks for being with us on this journey through the entire first season of Matryoshka of Lies. If you wanted to continue, please let us know and support the legacy Ukrainian journalism of Ukrainska Pravda. You can learn how at pravda.com.ua. If you like this show, please spare a minute to rate, comment, and share it. The Ukrainian production team creates every new episode against all odds, amid bombings and blackouts, so this show has to trend, and you can make it happen. The empire will fall.